I can hardly believe I'm here. I made it past the Camaro raffle. I survived the offer for reconstructive cosmetic surgery. And I've had my smart drugs for this evening, so glad to be here. Well, until a few minutes ago, I thought that this was a 45-minute gig, so you get to see grace under pressure this evening. Actually, I'm kidding. It doesn't matter how long it goes. We could never get to the bottom of this stuff. Nor would we wish to, I think. By coincidence merely, I became 45 yesterday. So it's sort of a good moment to do some summing up. So in thinking about this talk and knowing as I did who would be here, I thought that I would sort of orient the theme toward distilling the psychedelic mind, which is a way of talking about the psychedelic mind, but also trying to, considering the amount of money you paid for this session, give you the entire shtick in one fell swoop, so that you would never have to attend a Terence Mckenna lecture or workshop again. You could just move past that, turn the page on that kind of thing in your life. And I think it's coming together for me. I don't know whether it's writing these books. Was a very nice introduction here tonight, and the whammy in it was, after 25 years of being ignored by straight publishers, or publishers of any sort for that matter, it appears that I'm on the brink of entering the marketplace, if not the mainstream. So with your help and word-of-mouth advertising, maybe I can continue to meet my mortgage obligations. Okay, let's cut to the chase. Enough of the obligatory clowning around. The psychedelic question in the society just seems to refuse to go away. It sort of can't be swallowed and can't be spat up. And so society just sort of runs around, knocking into walls and kicking its feet in the air. And this has been the situation that we've been in for at least 30 years now. And as a person who has spent a great deal of time in the underground, I've observed amazement the persistence of the countercultural agenda to alter consciousness. And like many of you, I came to it in the 60s, when the basic argument in favor of altered states of consciousness were almost entirely narcissistic. Deep insight into yourself, an ability to overcome childhood programming, so forth and so on. And I certainly think, because of the kind of society we are, because of the kind of people society has made us, that this was a valid place to begin. But after 30 years of having the psychedelic issue on the social agenda, at times hailed as a universal panacea, at times demonized as a scourge from hell, but never quite silenced, never moved out of the public eye, I've reached a number of conclusions about this, and I thought it would be interesting tonight, I guess because of my recent birthday or something, to sort of try and distill all this and sum it up and put it in front of you in terms of what is psychedelic shamanism, why should people like ourselves who live in high-density electronic culture, why should we care about this? What does it say about our future? What does it say about us as a group? And what techniques are there that we each, on our own, can bring to bear on this question? So with your help, hold me to the straight and narrow, I'd like to make my way through this agenda this evening and talk about these various aspects of what, to my mind, is the most astonishing facet of reality. I mean, maybe sex is pressing hard in the second position, but these two things run neck and neck as aspects of the mystery of what it is to be human. And believe me, human psychedelic experiences and human sexual experiences are orders of magnitude removed from anything going on in the animal realm. These things are set apart from the rest of being because what we bring to them is mind. This is what we pour into the sexuality of human beings that makes it unique. This is what we pour into the contemplation of our own experience. Mind is a focus that is lacking, at least its expression in the unique form that we experience it, is lacking in the rest of nature. And I believe that the persistence of the psychedelic experience within the social agenda has to do with the fact that it actually addresses something basic in human beings. I mean, it may seem like a radical proposition to say that to a white, high-tech, industrial democracy audience, because we are the people who have drifted furthest from this birthright. And I would like to suggest to you this evening that much of the civilization that we have created has been achieved based on a direct denial of the psychedelic experience and all that it implies. Our humanness, our connection to the rest of nature, our connection into the feminine, our place in nature. Because for the Western mind, we have no fixed place in nature. Our place is ours to define. We are, from the point of view of the cultural machinery that empowers us, completely free to be whatever we want to be. Now, the problem with that prescription is that in Western culture, what that means is permission to express ego, permission to profligately use and destroy resources, permission to set aside the political agendas of outclasses and outgroups, and this untrammeled expression of will outside the context of nature has turned us into a kind of Frankenstein's monster at best, a toxic force in the body of the Gaian world soul at worst. And I believe that our origin and our future culmination and our present happiness all can be secured, understood, illuminated, and expanded only if we're willing to look at our relationship not only to altered states of consciousness, but to the mind behind nature. Because that's really what this is all about, to my mind. What these psychedelics are empowering or conveying or revealing, depending on, how you come at it, what they are showing us is that we are not alone upon this planet. We are not alone in the universe of mind. And I realize this is a soft audience to preach this in, because there are probably people within the sound of my words who sincerely believe they were once citizens of Zeta Reticuli. It's when the jar is so leaky, it's hard to know where to put the water. But I come to this as a show-me kind of guy. And so, though my conclusions may sound as flaky as anybody else's, it was hard for me to get this flaky. I didn't embrace it. I was forced to it. And this method works. You see, there are two ways to get flaky. You can just get flaky, which takes no effort at all, you just announce you're a walk-in, start eating wheatgrass juice, and, tithe to Maitreya. Or you can get flaky by testing the edges, by stretching the envelope of being. And this works for the most hard-headed among us. The aerospace insurance adjuster mentality is not only who I'm speaking to, but who I feel I represent. Because, no kidding, really. At age 18, I was a Marxist, an existentialist. I had ambitions in the field of aeronautical engineering, so forth and so on. And I discovered that you can take that kind of a mentality out into the theater of real experience, and you can come back a space bunny just like everybody else. So what that means then is that a straight person, and I speak as someone from the 60s with apologies to all our gay friends who later appropriated that word, because when I say straight, I mean unstoned. A straight person is not a guardian of truth or probity. A straight person is simply a frightened proto-flake. You see? I always think, and most of you have heard me say this, but when we get off on this subject, I always think about the wonderful thing Tim Leary said years ago. He said it so many years ago that when I told him how much I admired him for saying it, he didn't remember that he'd said it. But the man once said, wait till I give the line, LSD is a drug which occasionally causes psychotic behavior in people who have not taken it. You see? And I certainly saw this. I saw my parents become violently psychotic from not taking LSD. And so my point is, and I make it in a forum like this, because here we have so much permission for belief. You want to believe in, channeling from beyond the grave? Fine, no problem. You want to believe in the healing power of nematodes, hematite, you name it. We've got it all. Really, I think that the spirit of childlike, untrammeled curiosity is what we're striving for. Not the anal retentive, rational person, not the I'll go for anything channeling flake, but an attitude of we don't have to look far for miracles because they're all around us. Everything is astonishing. The universe on its surface is alive with mystery. Well, how do we make our way toward that? When we live in a culture, practice a language, embody a philosophy, scientific rationalism, which is entirely designed to suck wonder out of reality, to turn everything into shades of gray, to subvert all hope that lies outside the realm of career accomplishment and material possession. Well, the way that we can overcome this is through a personal acting out of what I have been calling now for several years the archaic revival. And I want to talk about that a little bit this evening because I think it, you know, however much we may kid around about the New Age, it is an important aspect of what is going on. Its triviality is rooted in the side of it which is ungrounded, ephemeral, and self-promoting. But it springs from a fairly profound and deep sense that things are not all right in this society. I think that I first encountered the phrase New Age in the writings of Helen Petrovna Blavatsky. She wrote in the 20s. I read her in the 50s. The New Age has been with us for a long time, so long that there's nothing new about it. And in fact, the reason I call it the archaic revival is because I think we can understand this movement if instead of accentuating what about it that is new, novel, and never before seen, instead we emphasize that this is a profoundly conservative impulse. A conservative impulse that would set the hair of George Bush and his skull and bones buddies standing on end. Because when we talk about conservative, we're not talking about returning to the era of Eisenhower. We're talking about returning to the era of Isis, Astarte, the great horned goddess of the high Paleolithic. In other words, this program of material civilization, exteriorization of ideas into matter through first alchemy and magic and then science and industry, this process is coming to an end, one way or another. We are either going to plant ourselves and most of the rest of the life on this planet by blindly pursuing this cultural model until we run it right over the edge into the apocalypse, or from the genes, from the bones, from the oceans, from the forests, from the glaciers, there is going to have to come a turning point, a change, a revulsion so profound that it allows us, by the tens of millions, to change how we think about reality, to change how we live. And I have ended up an advocate for the psychedelic experience, not because I think it's easy, not because I think it's surefire, but because I think it's the only game in town, the only chance left. If we had 1,000 years, If we had 500 years, maybe propaganda, messages on boxes of cereal, photographs on cart milk, I don't know, something might do it. But we don't have 500 years. We must come to a screeching halt now, because we are barreling toward the brink of ruin. And the only thing that I have ever seen that turned anybody around on the dime was psychedelics. You know? The talking cures invented by Freud and Jung at the beginning of this century, it takes years. Sometimes it never happens. The body work that came along behind that with Wilhelm Reich and others, Feldenkrais and so forth, Ida Rolf, all of this brings it into the theater of the body. At least now we understand it's a body-mind system. It's not a disembodied voice lying on a couch speaking, you know. But it seems so obvious. What we're trying to do is perturb the mind. We want to perturb the mind so that we can then see it differently, so that it may see and be seen differently. Well, the mind rests on a foundation of chemical machinery. We're not saying the mind is chemical machinery. We're saying the mind rests on a foundation of chemical machinery. So if you want to perturb the mind, you don't go to the talking. You don't go to the deep tissue. All of this has efficacy, but it is necessary, but not sufficient by itself. For there to be a sufficiency of method, there must be an initial perturbation of the mind. And this comes about through the use of psychedelic plants. This is not something that was discovered post-LSD in Manhattan by psychiatrists or in Prague or Berlin or at Esalen. This is a truth 25,000, 50,000, 100,000 years old. This is how it's always been done. Only in the last 6,000 years on the European continent and those civilizations that are the children of Europe has there been any other approach to these problems. Well, and what the other approach, linear thought, the phonetic alphabet, science, mathematical abstraction, so forth and so on, what these other approaches have brought us is toxicity, pollution, mutation, catastrophe, revolution, death, and yes, friends, even unhappiness. It hasn't worked. Western civilization is now crowing over the fact that the only opposition it ever had, which was Marxism, a pathetic, weak sister, has now collapsed upon itself. Well, there should be no congratulation in that, because the contradictions which undid Marxism lie in wait to undo this society as well. Both societies are materialistic. Both societies define human beings and treat them as things. And the fact of the matter is, Western civilization at this moment is a loaded gun pointed at the head of this planet. And we, for all our pretensions to a sensitivity to the presence of vitamin C or zinc in our diet or all the rest of this malarkey, we are the major prevaricators of this situation. So a certain obligation rests upon us. And I think we're meeting this obligation. I wouldn't say we're doing a great job or a terrible job. I think we're functioning at approximately a B+ level. You see, I mean, human life is so ephemeral. I mean, a person a person who lives 70 or 80 years is really as ephemeral as a mayfly or something. I mean, it's not long enough to get the full picture. For instance, many of you, by virtue of not having spent a great deal of time thinking about it, probably don't realize that this psychedelic plant shamanism option, this is not something that Western civilization has grappled with for centuries and come to terms with and found the proper pigeonhole for and put aside. Not at all, my friends. The fact of the matter is, all of this information about psychedelics has arrived in Western society in the last 100 years. And we have to say 100 years because we want to include things like mescaline. 1895-98, it began to be studied in Germany, and things like ibogaine, which was known toward the end of the last century, but which has had virtually zilch impact on American psychedelic populations. So we have to say the psychedelic option has only been an object of the Western mind's curiosity for approximately 100 years. But really, 90% of that occurred in the last 50 years. As many of you know, I am a great fan and spokesman for psilocybin, for the mushrooms. The mushrooms that I am so stoked on were discovered in 1953 by Gordon and Valentina Wasson in Huautla, discovered in 53, made absolutely Schedule I illegal in 1966. 13 years was the window in which Western civilization had to study this compound and figure out what it was for. And they were just beginning to focus upon it when it was made illegal. LSD, discovered in 37, not brought into the scientific literature until 48, not generally available even in the laboratory until 1950, made totally illegal in 1966. 16-year window. Think about the fact that when LSD was legal, psychiatrists, professional researchers were consistently reporting cures of chronic alcoholism with one 500 gamma dose. One dose. Cure, like a 50% cure rate without recidivism for chronic alcoholism. Spectacular findings were being reported. When LSD swept through the scientific community, for pharmacologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, it had the same kind of excitement and feeling of breakthrough that the splitting of the atom had for the physicists, for the physics community in the late 30s. Well, science, we are told, is this absolutely impartial, godlike body of knowledge prosecuted by great men, and it will fearlessly send its questing mind into any situation or environment. This is a mental discipline so dispassionate that it sees nothing at all wrong with strapping monkeys into apparatus and hurling them into walls at 70 miles an hour to study traumatic injuries. This is a discipline so unflinching in its pursuit of truth that it will design tiny television cameras to be implanted in plastic penises so that we can see the changes in the color of the vaginal wall as it approaches orgasm. I mean, these guys are unstinting in their devotion to truth in any form. And yet, for 30 years, science has accepted government's refusal to allow science to look at the potential impact of psychedelic plants and compounds on human consciousness, on chronic alcoholism, on schizophrenia, on depression, on autism, on learning disorders, on dyslexias, on memory enhancement, so forth and so on. This to me is obscene. The future is mental. Figure it out. If the mind does not loom large in the future history of this species, then what the hell kind of future is it going to be? I mean, this is our crowning glory, our aesthetic sensitivities, our ability to create values that are not simply based on the next meal, the next sexual encounter, the next empowering social move, but an ability to create social values based on creating a viable future environment for children, creating a viable present environment for the less fortunate among us, creating a social safety net so that the more maladaptive of us are not reduced to living under bridges and in abandoned automobiles. I mean, these are the things which set us above the apes. These are the things which take us out of the context of organic nature and make it seem as though, hey, there actually are some transcendental values being maximized here. There actually is something going on within the human family that if it were to be lost, fumbled away, compromised, or destroyed, the universe would be a poorer place for it. Truly a poorer place for it. And I think we take our humanness too much for granted. I don't think we realize how nasty, brutish, and short most of life has been over the centuries, and how really only within the confines of the 20th century has a level of comfort and food availability and shelter and basic creature needs been met to the point where most people can begin to lead the philosophical life that previously was the privilege of emperors, kings, great courts. Now we all indulge ourselves. We all have the philosopher king's point of view. We all have a model of history, a model of the future, and we all feel capable of stepping into the shoes of our leaders and discharging that responsibility. Well, in order to do that, I think we need to overcome our amnesia about how we got to this place. I don't see, you see, what science would have you believe and explicitly implies is that we are an aberration. Here, over here, you have nature, the beautiful rainforests, the wonderful coral reefs, the symmetry of the hummingbird, the sea urchin, and the butterfly. And here you have us, grimy, tawdry, polluting, ugly, driven, in equilibrium, in disequilibrium, in denial. I don't believe that. I believe that this kind of thinking that breaks humanity away from the rest of nature is the first of the great disempowering myths by which the Western mind has enslaved itself. And we are not outside of nature. We are not a runaway toxic process. We are not a mutation. We are, in fact, that part of nature which has been deputized for a purpose. We are the energy gathering aspect of the Gaian mind. We are the language forming capacity of nature herself. You may know the concept of a catalyst in chemistry. A catalyst is something which, when you stir it into a chemical reaction, the reaction proceeds more quickly, but the catalyst itself is not destroyed. And this is what I think we are. We are a strategy on the part of the Gaian mind to produce an effect that would otherwise take much, much longer to produce. The main effect of the presence of human life on this planet has been to vastly accelerate the speed at which nature is able to creatively express herself. And I would like to believe that this fragile thing which we call humanness, which is nothing more than a set of interlocking ideas which we share, ideas about caring and responsibility and generations yet unborn and obligation to the integrity of the earth and so forth and so on. I would like to believe that these things arose in us in a very, very brief window of opportunity. As you may or may not know, there's a lot of talk about the relationship between the masculine and the feminine in human beings and gender issues and so forth and so on. Well, if you go back into the primate line, what you discover is primates always have dominance hierarchies occupied by males. This is the bad news part of the thing. You see, it isn't that we are a perversion of the primate program. At this point, we exemplify it right down the line. But clear back to squirrel monkeys, you get male dominance hierarchies. Why is this? And why then is it even an issue for us? Why don't we just blindly accept it? I mean, there isn't a woman's liberation movement among termite societies or, among reindeer herds. So why are we so discomforted by our attitudes toward each other? Well, I believe it's because we actually created, at a certain point in our history, a kind of paradise. We actually solved all the problems which now bedevil us 20 to 15,000 years ago. And how this happened, and half of you, I hope, are amazed, and the other half will groan because you've heard it so many times before. What happened is an evolutionary synergy that occurred on the plains of Africa sometime over the last 100,000 years. It's that as the African continent dried up, our remote primate ancestors were forced out of the trees and onto the African grassland, where they were in an environment completely different from the kind of environment that our ancestors had been living in for millions of years. Gone were the fruit-filled bowers of the climaxed canopy of the rainforest. And instead, what there was a grassland with very little cover, a very restricted flora and fauna, and into that grassland pour these hungry, displaced, dispossessed, formerly fruitarian primates. When a species gets under that kind of pressure, it must make a choice between extinction or dietary expansion. Many species will choose extinction. This is an interesting thing about animal species. Most animal species eat one or two foods that they are very tightly focused in on. The reason for this, if you're not an evolutionary biologist, is it's a strategy for avoiding mutation. You see, all plants have a tendency to protect themselves from predation by producing toxins, mutagens, poisons is what we're talking about here. So an animal species will evolve a preference for just one or two food sources, and then it can hold its exposure to mutagenic agents to a minimum. Now, our species, when we moved into that African grassland situation, were plastic enough, malleable enough, that we decided, no, by God, we're not going to go to extinction because of the absence of papayas in this situation. We're going to test other foods. And we began testing other foods in that environment, and that immediately swelled the number of mutant strains in the human population. Now, in this grassland environment, the number of new foods to be tested was somewhat limited, and the most spectacular and obvious of the unfamiliar food sources in this environment were the psilocybin mushrooms seen to be growing in the cow pies of the many different kinds of cattle-like ungulate animals growing up in that environment. And if you've ever been to the tropics and seen the Stropharia cubensis mushroom in its natural habitat, you can't miss it. It's the most spectacular thing going on. I mean, you walk out into a Colombian pasture after a few days of mist and rain, and these mushrooms, the size of dinner plates, will be scattered across the environment. Now, when I was in Kenya in the late 60s, I observed baboon troops and their food gathering behavior, and what they were into was running around frantically looking for cow flops and then flipping them over, looking for beetle grubs or carrion beetles. You see, they understood that the cow flop, great phrase, huh? The fecal deposit of the ungulate animal was a vector for protein, insect protein. This was a likely place to find carrion beetles, worms, and what have you, and of course the mushroom. Well, when you observe how primates react when they're testing a food, they're very careful and they're very conscientious. A baboon will take a suspect potential food source, take a leaf, put it in their mouth. Just hold it there. No chewing, no nothing. Put it in their mouth. Wait 30 seconds. Chew. Wait. And then either spit it out or swallow. And if swallow, then begin to eat. Well, I believe that this encounter with the psilocybin mushroom, and in the course of this workshop, maybe in the question and answer period, we'll get to this, but psilocybin has unique properties which set us up for a sudden, enormous evolutionary kick in the pants. And we can talk among ourselves about whether this was just blind coincidence, good old chance, and aren't we fortunate for it, or whether benign extraterrestrials operating from their base on Zeta Reticuli were, we can save that for you. We don't have to get rid of it. Whether it was those shifty Zeta Reticulites or blind chance, whatever the force was, the exposure to psilocybin has three reinforcing consequences that are of tremendous importance for understanding human evolution. And they are as follows. Psilocybin, in very low doses so low that if you had taken this amount, you would not feel it, or you would be just slightly antsy. In other words, very low doses of psilocybin actually increase visual acuity. Means you improves your vision with this stuff. Well, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or an evolutionary biologist to figure out that if there's a plant in the environment and you're a hunting animal and this plant improves vision, you're going to be a better hunting animal if you include this plant in your diet. And this is precisely what happened. Early human or proto-hominid hunters accepted psilocybin into their diet. It made them better hunters. Being a better hunter means being more successful at obtaining food. Being more successful at obtaining food means more of your children reach reproductive age themselves, and so you outbreed the non-psilocybin using portion of the population. Simple enough, right? On the next level, remember I said this was a three-step process where each step reinforces the other. At slightly higher doses of psilocybin, you get what's called CNS arousal, central nervous system arousal. Well, now arousal is just what it sounds like. It's not only restlessness and alertness, but it's also a kind of horny, diffuse energy. It inclineth one's thoughts to the boudoir, is what I'm trying to say here. And so you get what primatologists and anthropologists charmingly describe as more frequent instances of successful copulation. And so what successful copulation means is, again, a factor feeding into more children of the psilocybin-using animals reaching reproductive age themselves. And then finally, and thirdly, beyond visual acuity, beyond sexual arousal, is the full-blown psychedelic tremendum, the full-blown religious revelation that goes with the mushroom experience. A revelation of such depth and breadth that we, 20,000 years later, with all our epistemic sophistication and our parallel processing computers and all this other malarkey, are completely in awe of, completely unable to come to terms with. Well, this higher dose of psilocybin was usually experienced in the context of the middle range dose of psilocybin. So it went on in an atmosphere of group religious ecstasy and orgy. I mean, that's just how it happened, folks. Orgy was a part of human sexuality before the invention of agriculture. I'm absolutely convinced of it. You see, the growth of the human intellect over evolutionary spans of time is a kind of conquest of dimensionality. And the conquest of dimensionality that gave us agriculture, unfortunately, gave us male dominance and patriarchy. And the reason for this is not far to seek. A new intellectual horizon of cause and effect was being explored. Women, who were the gatherers in the hunter-gatherer equation, were realizing for the first time the causal relationship that exists between burying a half-eaten meal over here and coming back a year later on your annual nomadic peregrination and discovering food plants growing where you buried your uneaten meal of a year ago. In other words, women came to understand the relationship between the act of planting and the appearance of usable food plants sometime later. At the same time that this was going on, men were making the connection between the fact that the sex act had something to do with the fact that 9 months later a woman would bear a child. And in a way, this was the beginning of the straight lockstep march into hell. Because once men had this notion of male paternity, it became more important to know who your children were than it was to participate in the orgiastic, group-minded bonding that had previously occurred. And once you have the notion of my child, then it moves naturally to my woman, my weapons, my food, my hunting ground, my everything. The recognition of male paternity gave permission for the growth of ego. And ego, and this was all a continuous thought, those of you who doubted, this was all a continuous thought. Ego is our problem, and we always had it when we were squirrel monkeys, howler monkeys, proboscis monkeys, and all that. We only lost it in that very brief window of opportunity, maybe 20, maybe 30, 40,000 years long, when, as we evolved into the grassland, we included in our diet essentially a drug which corrected our primate nature, a drug which suppressed the expression of male dominance, a drug which promoted an orgiastic sexual style that promoted group values. Because you see, and this is the point to my mind about psychedelics, what they do, not, my trip or your trip, which we could spend hours trading stories about, but when you try and talk about what is the effect of the psychedelic experience, not one or two of them, but 100,000 of them, what generalizations can we make? The generalization that I have found most powerful is the psychedelic experience dissolves boundaries. That's what it does. And boundaries are what chain, diminish, define, and degrade us. And we are always creating them, and we are always struggling with dissolving them. And the ultimate boundary is this belief in the sanctity of the ego versus everything else in the cosmos. And I believe that that the ego arose in a context of language, culture, religion, and so forth, simply because we evolved in the African grassland, and the climate itself underwent changes that eventually placed the mushroom out of reach. And this is why the fall into history. This is what that Genesis story about that I call history's first drug bust. This is what it's about. I mean, isn't it a little peculiar that the Ur myth of our culture opens with a drug bust? It's the story of a woman, right, those bad women, a woman who corrupts her roommate, and then they both get kicked out. And they break the lease, essentially, and they both get kicked out. And where they get kicked out of is into history. And I believe that the Genesis story, definitely told and created at a time when patriarchy was on a roll, is a memory of this break with this orgiastic, goddess-centered nomadic, cattle-oriented, mushroom-using form of human pastoralism. Now, notice in this scenario that there are no villains per se. The planet began to get dry, and that's what broke up this arboreal, papaya-oriented paradise in the treetops, where everybody was male-dominated and mindless as a tomato, but having a good time. The drying of the African continent broke that party up, created a mixed ecology of forest and grassland, into which the primates then evolved this fascinating relationship with the cattle, you see. And much of what I say here is orthodox evolutionary theory. It's just the part about psilocybin that nobody else will touch with a 10-foot pole. But moving out into the grassland, testing foods, accepting psilocybin into the diet, and then creating, based on the interruption of the natural tendency toward male dominance, it was fixed 50,000 years ago. A pharmacological intervention on the entire species created then a situation of partnership. The women were the gatherers, the men were the hunters. This had to do with promotion of different body types that had was already well established in these primates. I mean, you get this throughout the primates. The large male, barrel-chested, the more diminutive female, and the females largely more social than the male. The males hunt. And in the proto-hominid situation, this was certainly true. And hunting, as you know, if you've ever done it, places a great premium on stoic waiting. That's the hunter's job, is to sit down and keep your mouth shut and watch silently until it's time to make your move, and then move ruthlessly, without question, with attention. Women had a completely different set of pressures and constraints on them. As gatherers, it was very important for women to be able to communicate extraordinarily subtle aspects of the material world to each other, so that a woman needs to be able to say, when she comes into camp with an apron full of nuts, I got these near the waterfall, by the bush with the small yellow leaves, with the waxy flowers and the red berries that has the dry grass underneath it. In other words, for a gatherer, there is tremendous premium put on being able to describe your environment. You must be able to communicate, because a woman who makes a food find can only bring back to camp as much food as she can carry. But if she can communicate to her sisters what is going on, then no problem. So language, I believe, largely evolved as a prerogative of women. And this stoicism and ability to tolerate uncomfortable conditions was evolved by men.